Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. I'm actually joined here with someone that I really look up to on many regards, with a very large experience in Washington, D.C. on American politics and a keen knowledge on mineral policy. When we're talking about the geopolitics of critical mineral, I'd like to start first maybe from a U.S. perspective. When you look at the importance of rare earth and other critical minerals in the energy transition, the Americans are maybe not the leading power in the pack, and how do you explain this? Is it because of a lack of adequate policy or for different reasons?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to just recognize the minister and the sponsors of this conference. Yes. It's quite a statement that I think is being made by the kingdom. But to your question, as far as the United States is concerned and our policy on critical minerals, I think if you take the first look, you'd have to say critical minerals obviously is an important piece to the energy transition that we are all underway with. And if you're thinking about policy and a consensus, I'm not sure that I would even go as far as to say that in the U.S. right now there is consensus across the political spectrum as far as the need for the energy transition. It's here. I think many of us embrace it. I think there's a large part and slice of the population, though, that can't quite understand why we need to move away from fossil fuels. But be that as it may, I mention that because I do think it gets in the way of a consensus on policy as far as the energy transition is concerned and as far as a policy on critical minerals. But for that, I think you have to go back 10 years ago, where I do think there was a wake-up call in Washington for sure, in the U.S. at large, when we saw China take steps to limit the export of critical minerals and rare earths in particular. And before that, there really wasn't a lot of recognition on the part of policymakers. That was a wake-up call. I think that what occurred thereafter is when the WTO stepped in to resolve the dispute between many countries, certainly the U.S., Japan, others, and China. The dispute was resolved in our favor, but it did serve as a wake-up call, and I think we've seen the U.S. take action since. First, when President Trump was in office, he declared almost a national emergency in the mining industry. He called for the creation of a critical minerals list, and also his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he went about forming a sort of coalition of nations and started this energy resource group to begin to share sort of best practices with one another, and so the U.S. could come in and help in terms of developing, researching in terms of critical minerals. So I do think we're beginning to see some progress. Many of you in the industry know that there are some active projects underway in not only the critical minerals area, but rare earths, and even to that very hard technological piece on processing. We still got a long way to go, though.
I mean, you started mentioning, obviously, the relation between China and the U.S., which obviously is probably one of the key, element of development on the geopolitical stage. How much of this will actually impact the question of security of supplies for critical minerals, and maybe the foreign, relations with other countries, whether in emerging markets here in the Middle East and others, to make sure that, both economies or one over the other have actually access to those critical inputs for their economy?
So I do think, this is much about the U.S.-China relationship. I mentioned earlier the critical minerals injection into that relationship, and certainly during the Trump administration, there was increasing awareness about rare earths amidst the trade war between our two countries. And I think it is reflective of the larger context of the U.S.-Sino relationship right now. And if you take a step back and look at sort of the real macro situation in Washington, I think we are very influenced at home by a decision that was made 20 years ago, and that was the vote in the U.S. Congress to approve China's ascension into the World Trade Organization. Obviously, it was a move taken by many, many countries that are parties to that multilateral organization. But in the U.S. in particular, I think the feeling was if we went ahead and allowed for that to occur, you would see China step up, join the community, if you will, of international adherence to international norms and the rule of law, and really begin to practice like we most do in the free market system that we operate in. And the belief then was that if China did not do that, that they would fail. Well, clearly here we are today. I don't think either has happened. Certainly China has not failed, but nor in the view of many has China made that sort of step towards adherence to the norms that we're used to and the rule of law that we practice under. And so that tends to color the outlook of policymakers. And when it comes to rare earths in particular, as the facts are, and the industry players here know as well as any, that China has an outsized role, not only in the production, but certainly in the processing of rare earths. And so I do feel that what that's done in terms of the policy making in Washington, it has emboldened those who want to get even tougher on China. And many have seen sort of the back and forth between the two countries as far as investment protection. We've got this body in Washington called CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S., and the laws that govern that body got a lot stricter over the last several years and basically put the onus on any investment coming from China having to bear the burden of proof. So with all that having been said, I do think it is time for my country to step up and say, look, we've got to have a policy as far as rare earths is concerned. I spoke before about maybe the wake-up call, but as you know, in America, the government plays less of a role in our economy than pretty much any other country, certainly industrial country in the world. And so there's this notion that sometimes we ought not have Washington in the business of picking winners and losers as far as industry is concerned, or we ought not put Washington in a position to allocate capital because the accountability is not there. And I think when it comes to rare earths, we're going to have to take a step to make that a priority. And if one calls that industrial policy, so be it. I think it's important enough given the demand for rare earths as far as electric vehicles and batteries and wind turbines, the rest, that we are going to have to do this in order to escape being so vulnerable to those like China that control this industry. So we'll see where it ends up. Maybe another key trend that we've seen over the last few years is obviously the acknowledgement of climate change and a series of agreements, Paris agreements obviously on climate change. The US maybe not leading the pack here on these issues, but when you're seeing this importance of climate change mitigation, the rise of demands for ESG in terms of exploitation of minerals, how do we make sure that we don't strike the pendulum too far also, and we actually factor in the need for mining productions and therefore obviously, in innovation in the sector, but making sure that we actually implement the right ESG factors without putting in jeopardy the supplies of those critical minerals? It's a really interesting question because I think there's a bit of irony, and I mentioned this sort of large swath of the U.S. population, and any Americans in here know of what I speak, that haven't quite stepped up on this energy transition journey we're on. It's ironic, though, because so much of the need for green energy and the rest have come from many activists and thought leaders on the left that tend to identify more with environmental activism. And so it's sort of brought about now the need for and the incredibly increasing demand for critical minerals. Yet, when it comes to permitting, when it comes to investment in mining that's so critical to fuel the energy transition, then the left will say, well, wait a minute, we're not for doing that either. And it's a very analogous situation do you have in the nuclear industry as well. If we think about alternatives, that's certainly one that's doesn't aggravate the carbon emission situation, but yet has extreme opposition on the activist community in the U.S. So it's sort of a situation of irony. And I think this, again, comes down to political will. Mm-hmm. Will our country come down and, as you suggest, Remi, put its foot down and say, look, we need some balance. We need to be measured in this policy, because if we're truly going to be about this energy transition, you can't escape the fact that you need these minerals and rare earths from these minerals, and we don't want to be beholden to a competitor, or some would say adversary, like China, so we better get straight with what our policy is and be balanced in the approach. I'm not sure we're there yet.
Thank you. Maybe looking specifically at Saudi Arabia and the opportunities for Saudi Arabia to grow its mining sector. What are the opportunities for Saudi Arabia there? And especially in terms of the American-Saudi relationship, how can that offset a series of potential geopolitical risks if you strongly, reinforce that relationship, especially in the mining sector?
Well, first of all, I would say that, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the last several years has become, I believe, a real hotspot for foreign direct investment. And I think credit goes to many in this room, and the sponsors, the minister, and others, and certainly the Crown Prince and the King here in the Kingdom, to make it a priority that this country becomes a major player in the global economy. And I know with Vision 2030, there is a real demonstrated commitment to diversify the economy, and I think there's a stated goal of tripling the contribution of mining to the greater GDP of the kingdom. That right there have all the elements: the political commitment, the will. The minister before had mentioned the implementation of a regulatory framework for investors to come. Obviously, the fact that we're here at this conference, the first of its kind here in the kingdom, I think is a recipe for real success. Now, as far as the U.S.-Saudi impact, I've always said that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is of prime import. Mm-hmm. I think the security of this kingdom is inextricably tied to the security of the U.S. and its interest here, and vice versa. And the strengthening of Saudi's position in the rare earths critical mineral realm, I think, can only be beneficial to the United States as we continue to try and establish this very global market for critical minerals that is diversified, sustainable, and secure.
Maybe one question. I mean, we've preparing for this discussion, we talked about Canada. There's actually a good example of collaboration with Saudi Arabia, with Ma'aden and Barrick, a Canadian company, investing for quite a few years in the mining sector here. I mean, how Canada can be maybe a good example to follow, looking at a different perspective on critical mineral management and mining as a whole, and might be actually a good source of inspiration for the US moving forward.
So, if any Canadians are in here, we have this very special relationship with our neighbor to the north. We're blessed with a good neighborhood in North America. So, I think, first of all, Canada is a country whose DNA really reflects mining. I think clearly the percentage of mining in terms of its contribution to GDP in Canada is a lot greater than that which it is in the U.S. And so I think they do have a mindset to affect a more favorable, at least certain and transparent permitting process that accompanies any kind of large investment in the mining industry. And much more predictable. Not to say that they don't have tremendous environmental protections that go along with that in Canada. But I think because Canada doesn't have the size of industrial base that, let's say, a U.S. has, a Europe or Japan has, they don't have the indigenous demand the way that the U.S. does for critical minerals and rare earths. So I think Canada's sort of orient is more towards how do we go about fitting within the alliance globally. I think for the U.S. that's very helpful because, as I said before, the prerequisite is to make a commitment in the U.S. that we are going to prioritize a strong presence in the critical minerals arena, and that we commit ourselves to a diverse supply as well as processing environment worldwide, not just centered in China.
No, absolutely. And this kind of Canadian regulatory framework can be a good blueprint here for Saudi Arabia, and the collaboration between Canadian companies and Ma'aden could be something to look for in terms of American investment here in Saudi in critical minerals to move towards this energy transition. I think you made this case very clear, and I very much thank you for being here. Thank you, Eric, and thank you for all of you being here. So please join me in thanking Eric for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.